Thanks, and thanks again to Professor Jones and all the sponsors who helped set this up. I want to shift a little bit of the theme of the panel. The theme of the panel is talking about immigration along the border. You know, as somebody who, I'm a native of South Texas. I spent about 20 years there, went to graduate school in Texas. I spent most of my 20s in the state as well. And for the past 10 years or so, I've lived in Iowa, working at the University of Iowa. And that has given me sort of these differential perspectives on what politics is like along the border and what politics and immigration enforcement is like within the interior of the United States. And as I've witnessed both of those worlds, I've become increasingly interested in how interior enforcement has changed across time and sort of what have been the effects of interior enforcement. And that has been something that we have seen change very dramatically over the past couple of years. And so what I'll do right now is I'll kind of like trace the changing nature of immigration enforcement over the past 15 years, over the past 8 years in particular, and then we'll draw some lessons and inferences for how we might see a continuation of that change under a Trump presidency. So the first thing to note is when you think about immigration enforcement under the Obama administration, what you really have is a policy which is akin to something called attrition through enforcement, or what is sometimes colloquially called self-deportation. The idea of self-deportation is one which originates by an individual named Chris Kobach, Secretary of State of Kansas, immigration policy advisor to Mitt Romney during the 2012 presidential election, and immigration advisor to presidential candidate and now President Trump. Right. In 2007, Kobach publishes an article in which he says that illegal aliens can be encouraged to depart the United States on their own through a concerted strategy of attrition through enforcement. If the risks of detention or involuntary removal go up, the only rational decision is to return home. He makes an argument that we have set up this false choice in immigration debates between sort of mass amnesty and mass deportation, and who in their right mind would support mass amnesty, and who in their right mind, such as the man standing next to Chris Kobach in that picture, would support a policy of mass deportation. And instead, what we need to do is basically just make it more and more costly to be more and more risky to be in the United States. And you don't have to engage in mass deportation, but if you just make it more and more risky and you just deport more and more individuals, then other people are just going to opt out, and they're just going to go ahead and deport on their own. They're going to self-deport. All right, so for every person you deport, maybe another person will deport on their own, maybe two people will deport on their own, a pattern like that. Now that's the idea that comes from Kobach, that is endorsed by Romney, that is, at first Trump does not advocate it because he advocates a more stringent policy, and then he later retracts and begins to advocate that same policy. But this is not a Republican idea. This is the exact same policy that we saw during the Obama administration. The policy which Romney advocates in 2012 as a critique of the Obama administration is actually the policy which the Obama administration has in fact been implementing. But of course, Obama in the context of that election cannot really acknowledge that that in fact is his policy, because he's sort of boxed in politically. One way of illustrating this is by looking at the number of deportations. Here I'm going to use the word removals, the technical word that's used by immigration enforcement officials over time. And you can see that that number has gone up quite dramatically over the past couple of years, right? And so that now we're averaging around 400,000 removals annually. That number has sustained over the Obama administration. It increases before the Obama administration. He's not responsible for the dramatic increase, but that number has not really declined dramatically. And this runs sort of counter to the narrative of the Obama administration, which is this idea of maybe some stringent enforcement during the early years as he tried to convince Republicans that he was tough on immigration, that he could secure the border, but then this sort of drawback, this pullback over the second half of the administration as he began to tell immigration enforcement officials that they really had to concentrate on people who had been convicted of serious crimes, as he began to exempt huge swaths of the undocumented population from deportation with DAPA and DACA, right? But despite those efforts, that number stays the same. Once the apparatus is built to develop the capacity to have 400,000 annual removals, that number remains. What's more shocking about how that number remains is the actual amount of people who are entering the country without documentation. So this is, now don't worry about the y-axis in this graph. But what I wanted you to focus on in the trend. This is a trend in the rate of entry for undocumented Mexican immigrants that's developed by the Princeton sociologist Doug Massey through his data with the Mexican Migration Project. And of course, immigrants come from a variety of countries. Those who are, many of them don't come from Latin America. Almost everybody who's removed actually comes, over 90% of individuals who are deported are of Latin American origin, so that it does make sense to sort of isolate that population when we have this discussion. But of course, they come from a variety of Central American, South American countries. But the plurality of individuals who are undocumented, the majority of individuals who are undocumented from Latin America come from Mexico. So let's look at Mexican rates of immigration without documentation over time. They're going down, right? And they have been going down steadily. They have not gone down as a change of policy that's occurring. We see the changes of policy that I'm going to show you in a little bit that occur under the Obama administration. They don't shift that trend. Now, if you want to be naive and you want to say, well, what's the rate of entry during the Obama administration? What's the rate of entry prior to the Obama administration? You can say, all right, the rate of entry is lower. Maybe that looks like effectiveness, but it is only lower because of long-standing trends that are not responsive to changes in public policy. These are things that are the product of like changes in the fertility rate in Mexico 30 years ago, right? That 30 years later manifest themselves in fewer individuals needing to migrate. Changes in domestic economic conditions in Mexico, changes in economic conditions, of course, within the United States, 2008, and the Great Recession being the most notable. So it's not only that you have really high levels of deportation, but you have high levels of deportation when you have fewer people who are coming into the country, right? And so that's your easiest pool of people to deport, right? Individuals who are coming into the country without authorization. So how, if fewer people are entering the country without documentation, are we possibly deporting more people or continuing to deport the same high number of people, right, with fewer entrants? Well, in order to understand that, you have to understand how enforcement has really shifted over the past couple of years away from the border and into the interior of the United States. So you think about all enforcement activity occurring within the auspice of the Department of Homeland Security, but there are many units within the Department of Homeland Security that are responsible for enforcement activities. Let's just simplify it and let's point out two, Border Patrol and ICE, or Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Border Patrol, of course, is responsible primarily for enforcement activities along the border. Right? ICE is responsible for does some activity along the border, but is of course the primary unit which is responsible for enforcement within the interior. So think about it as border enforcement and interior enforcement, okay? Now within ICE, let's break it up into two more subunits. Something called HSI and something called ERO. HSI is a unit that stands for Homeland Security Investigations. This is a unit which goes after really serious organized crime. If you are a drug trafficker, if you are engaged in human trafficking, HSI is the unit that's going to try and grab you. If you follow ICE on social media, every day they're posting something, they're saying, hey, look at this person who we have apprehended and we're deporting, look at the horrible things this person has done. Isn't it a great thing and amazing that we have brought this person into custody and we are removing this person from the United States? Usually that person they're advertising, of course, has in fact done really horrible things, is not a very sympathetic individual. That person has almost always been apprehended through the HSI program. Alternatively, there's a unit called ERO, Enforcement and Removal Operations. This is the unit that goes after sort of day-to-day individuals. Now, some of these people may have committed crimes. Some of these they're not drug traffickers. They're not involved in organized crime, so they're not drug traffickers or human traffickers primarily. But someone who may have possessed a small amount of marijuana, right? That person could be apprehended through ERO. But also individuals who have no criminal record, many of them are also going to be apprehended through ERO. So let's think about it as border, interior, and then within interior, let's think about it as really serious criminals or people who have more sort of minor criminal offenses or no criminal offenses whatsoever. And let's look at how enforcement has changed across time. Well, I've told you that the number of people entering the United States without documentation has gone down. One of the ways that you see that is if you look at the number of apprehensions across time, you can see that the number of people who are being apprehended by Border Patrol is going down across time. It shifts, it picks up a little bit at the end, right? We know we have a little spike in individuals coming from Central America in 2013, right? But look at what we're talking about in 2005. Overwhelmingly, all the apprehensions are coming from Border Patrol. And if you look there in 2011, they're at parity. we are bringing in the same number, ICE is apprehending the exact same number of people as Border Patrol. It's the first time in American history that happened. You can see there that the change is actually pretty sudden around 2008. What happens in 2008 is the piloting of the Secure Communities program, which some of you may be familiar with, right, which gets expanded over the course of the Obama administration. The Secure Communities program basically turns every county jail into a screener for ICE, so that anytime anyone is booked into a county facility, their fingerprints are always sent to the FBI in case this person is wanted for some kind of federal violation. Now they're also always sent to ICE, and ICE has a database, and ICE now can get aware of any time anybody without documentation is suspected to be having been brought in to any kind of state or local jailing facility. Right? Gives them an intense network with which to work from. Now, the Obama administration expands secure communities. Now, in the latter half of the Obama administration, the Obama administration actually sort of winds secure communities down. It actually terminates it. It replaces it with an alternative program called the Priority Enforcement Program, which, if you read the details of, is basically secure communities with just a little bit less teeth. But the apparatus is still in place. And then, of course, once that apparatus is in place and President Trump takes office, all he has to do is sign one executive order, which he did earlier this week, and Secure Communities is back. And it is now officially back and reinstated. Right? So that's what we see happening in 2008. That's what we see is largely responsible for the increase in ICE apprehensions over the course of the Obama administration. So interior enforcement, now basically on par with border enforcement. Let's break it up. Let's look at that interior enforcement, and let's look at how much efforts we're seeing from HSI and ERO. And I don't think you need to run a really complicated set of statistical analyses to look at what happened in 2008 there with the piloting of secure communities. We see that interior enforcement is primarily focused with this HSI unit, and then in 2008, ERO pops on the scene in a big way, and their efforts remained and are sustained. And so now we have, over the course of the Obama administration, a developing norm of interior enforcement instead of border enforcement, and an interior norm, and a norm within the interior of increasingly going after individuals who are not serious criminals. We can break this up further, because ICE isn't going to tell you how many serious criminals they're apprehending exactly. They're going to tell you how many criminals or non-criminals, and then they'll have a categorization, and they'll tell you how many serious criminals or minor criminals they have. But in their categorization, they're going to put a lot of things in that serious criminal category. One of the things they'll put in that serious criminal category is an immigration violation, which is in immigration law considered an aggravated felony. That is so crossing the country without authorization, without documentation, right? That's an aggravated felony in immigration law. That puts you in the serious criminal category in the publicly reported ICE data. But what I did, this is some data that I got from a FOIA request, in which I have the records of all the people who've been deported over a few years, and this is all the people who've been deported in 2014. And I asked them, well, what's the most serious criminal violation that these individuals have committed? Well, the plurality of individuals and these are people who have been removed by ICE. So remember, some people might be removed by ICE, some people might be removed by Border Patrol. People who are removed by Border Patrol, by nature, haven't committed a violent crime or property crime. Like they just crossed. That's why they're apprehended from Border Patrol. So they haven't had a time to commit a violent crime yet, right? So most of those people are either non-criminals or only guilty of the immigration violation. So these are only people who are removed from ICE, right? So I'm biasing kind of in favor of finding a population with more criminal activity. The plurality of people, no criminal record, right? No criminal convictions. The most common criminal conviction, an immigration violation. That is the most common criminal offense. Now, of course, undocumented immigrants, right? Illegal immigrants, illegal aliens, if you want to use Kobach's language, aren't they all criminals, right? Remember, being in the country without authorization is not a criminal offense. It's a civil offense. It's not a criminal offense. Entering the country without authorization is a criminal offense. Being in the country without authorization, after you've already been removed, after you've already been deported, and you've now violated your removal order, that's a criminal offense. So there are ways, but not everyone is actually guilty of a crime just for being undocumented. But some people are. That's the most common. The next most common, a series of minor. There are over 400 different types of crimes that I coded in this data. A series of minor things, traffic offenses. I can't tell you the sort of bizarre things that could go. 7 people were deported for fishing in marine sanctuary areas. A lot of various things. Drug crimes, this includes distribution, this includes possession, this includes all, more serious drugs, heroin, cocaine, but marijuana, right? So there, all right, you're talking about, maybe 20-something thousand people. Violent crime, property crime. So there we're talking again, sort of 10, another 20,000, another 20,000 or so. Terrorism, that's a tongue-in-cheek thing, just to put in there. Its number is not actually 0, there are 21 people. But 21 people out of about, remember, 400,000 or so, right? So the national security angle is not really a good angle, right? That's a really inconsequential fraction. Okay, so Donald Trump in that 60 Minutes interview he had when he was president-elect said that we're going to deport, in his administration, 3 million drug dealers and gang members. Drug offenders, violent crime offenders, that's about 50,000 people. So 50,000 people times 4, it's about 200,000 people. He wants to get that number up to 3 million. Okay, right. The other thing I want to illustrate, though, is that one of the things this has done is it's created this huge range in enforcement across the country. So let's look prior to secure communities as sort of the variation in regional enforcement that we see. So the ERO, that office, they divide the country into a bunch of different jurisdictions. They call them field offices, right? And field offices some states, California, Texas, right? They got a couple field offices in them. My home state of Iowa, it's in a field office that has Minnesota, Iowa, North Dakota, South Dakota, Kansas. So some of them are sort of multi-state. Some of them are single state, like Arizona is a single state field office. The variation there prior to secure communities is tiny. Afterwards, it's huge, and we see this huge explosion. And so some immigrants are living in areas where the number of apprehensions is really low, and some of them are living in areas where the apprehension rate is really, really high. And so there's this real unevenness in the nature of immigration enforcement, which is something that we really, really need to understand. Now, the Obama administration tries to rein it in over the second half, right? You can see it peak in 2011 there, and you can see the Obama administration try to rein it in. But once the apparatus is built, he can only rein it in so much. And if you look at what's happening there in 2014, and you compare it to what's happening prior to 2008, 2006, 2007, it's still huge. Right, even if it's less than what's happening in 2011. So even the de-escalation we see in the Obama administration still brings us to a point that is far different than what we saw prior to the Obama administration. I also want to point out that immigrants feel these things. This is a survey question from the Pew. We asked people, compared to George W. Bush, would you say that Obama has deported more, fewer, or the same number of immigrants? Let's look at the odds that an immigrant says that they see Obama as deporting more people. And then let's look at the number of people who are deported from that person's county, sort of adjusted per capita. The more people are deported, the more people are to perceive this, to say that Obama is deporting more people. In fact, note there that the majority of Latino immigrants in the survey say that Obama has deported more people across the whole range. Now ask a whole bunch of whites, ask which white restrictionist, has Obama deported more people or fewer people than George W. Bush, right? Obviously, the modal category for that population is not more, but for the Latino population, for the immigrant population, it's more, right? This is even more striking. Do you know somebody who has been deported or detained by the government for immigration reasons in the last year, right? And of course, that's also responsive to these changes, right? So that you could see up 17% up to sort of 37% across, depending on what type of county the person's living in, that know somebody personally who within the past year has been deported. And so I want to show these trends. I want to document these shifts. I want to say we should study these shifts. I want to say that these shifts are felt by the population. And then I want to mention how we're going to see the escalation of this over the next few years. Earlier this week, President Trump signs an executive order. He says in the executive order on enhancing public safety in the interior of the United States, interior enforcement in our nation's immigration laws is critically important to the national security and public safety of the United States. And as part of that, he advocates denying of federal grants to sanctuary cities or non-compliant jurisdictions. He advocates the expansion of enforcement priorities. So the Obama administration tries to rein it in. It tells ICE, it tells DHS, focus on serious criminals. Well, it says focus on serious criminals. That's them focusing on serious criminals, right? That's that's what they're doing when they're being told to focus on serious criminals. And the Trump administration has relaxed that, has told them not to have that same emphasis, has grossly expanded the number of things which now count as of behavior or violation that makes you a priority for deportation. The hiring of 10,000 more ICE enforcement officials, right? And so these trends are present. They've been present under the Obama administration. The Obama administration is responsible for the building of the apparatus, and now we're going to see a new administration take hold of that apparatus and use it much, much more aggressively than I think we've seen over the past couple of years. Thanks.